My own parents systematically contacted every major financial firm in the city to brand me a thief. Everywhere I went, my reputation was slaughtered before I even walked through the door. I was rejected and humiliated again and again without having any idea why, until I discovered who was orchestrating my ruin. But my family did not know one crucial detail. My late grandfather had anticipated their greed and prepared for this exact day. When his final will was opened, the entire room fell dead silent, because I was not the one who was exposed as a criminal. I am Zuri, 35 years old, and a senior financial auditor who spent her entire career building an untouchable reputation. Or so I thought. I sat in the pristine glass-enclosed boardroom of a Fortune 500 firm in downtown Chicago, feeling an overwhelming sense of triumph. I had just delivered a flawless presentation for a director-level position. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been falsely accused of something you did not do and had to fight to clear your name. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 42nd floor, illuminating the polished mahogany table between me and the hiring manager. Mr. Harrison was a stern veteran of the corporate financial world. For the past hour, he had been nodding in deep appreciation as I walked him through complex forensic accounting models and corporate risk assessment strategies. I had spent the last 6 months unemployed, living strictly off my dwindling savings while searching for the perfect role. This was it. The salary was $180,000 a year with full executive benefits and generous stock options. It was the financial lifeline I desperately needed to secure my independence. I wore my sharpest navy blue suit, my posture straight, my confidence radiating from every word I spoke. I answered every technical question with absolute precision. Mr. Harrison even smiled genuinely, telling me that my background in untangling corporate fraud was exactly what his firm needed to clean up their newly acquired subsidiaries. He reached for my pristine leather-bound portfolio, his silver pen hovering over the final sign-off sheet that would send me straight to human resources for immediate onboarding. The relief washing over me was absolutely intoxicating. I was finally going to get my career back on track and leave the shadow of my family behind for good. But then his desk phone blinked. A short red light flashing frantically in the quiet room. He held up an index finger, asking for a brief moment as he picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. I watched his face closely, expecting a quick administrative interruption. Within seconds, his polite and welcoming expression completely evaporated. His jaw tightened instantly, and his eyes flicked up to stare at me with a chilling mixture of disgust and alarm. The comfortable warmth in the room vanished completely, replaced by a suffocating and heavy tension. He placed the phone back on its cradle with a heavy thud that echoed in the glass room. He did not say a single word at first. He simply picked up my leather portfolio, the one containing my flawless resume, my impeccable professional references, and my hard-earned industry certifications. He pushed it across the smooth mahogany table. It stopped right at the edge nearest to me, hanging over the precipice. I blinked in absolute confusion, the triumphant smile freezing awkwardly on my face. I politely asked him if there was a problem with my application or if human resources needed additional background documentation to finalize the offer. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his heavy leather chair, crossing his arms defensively across his chest. His voice was completely devoid of the warm professional courtesy he had shown me just 2 minutes prior. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "We are ending this interview right now, Zuri. We do not employ embezzlers in this building." The word hit me like a physical blow to the center of my chest. Embezzler. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. I sat frozen in my chair, completely unable to process what he had just accused me of. "I am a forensic auditor," I stammered, my voice trembling slightly as the shock washed over me. "My entire professional career is built on finding stolen money, not taking it. There has to be a massive misunderstanding here. Who did you just speak to on that phone?" I demanded to know what was going on, but Mr. Harrison simply shook his head, his expression hardening into a thick wall of absolute contempt. He coldly informed me that his firm conducted thorough background investigations, and they had just received highly credible information from a verified primary source regarding my abrupt departure from my previous position at my family company. I tried to explain that I had resigned voluntarily to pursue other corporate opportunities, but he raised his hand forcefully to silence me. He pressed a silver button on his desk intercom and requested building security to the 42nd floor boardroom immediately. Pure panic and blinding outrage flared hot in my chest. I pleaded with him to let me see whatever fabricated documentation he was referring to. I looked him in the eyes and told him I had never stolen a single dime in my entire life. But he ignored me entirely, turning his expensive chair toward his computer monitor and acting as if I no longer existed in the room. Less than a minute later, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Two large security guards in dark professional suits stepped heavily inside. They did not ask me politely to leave the premises. One of them stepped right up to the back of my chair and firmly instructed me to gather my personal belongings and keep my hands where they could see them at all times. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sheer injustice of the situation burned the back of my throat. I slowly picked up my leather portfolio and my black purse, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the thick leather straps. The guards positioned themselves tightly on either side of me, treating me like a high-risk corporate criminal who might steal confidential office files on the way out the door. They marched me out of the glass boardroom and directly into the main corporate lobby of the finance department. The timing could not have been more horrific. It was the middle of the morning coffee rush, and the sprawling open concept floor was packed with hundreds of senior executives, financial analysts, and administrative staff. As I was flanked by the intimidating security team, conversations across the floor abruptly stopped. The rhythmic typing on hundreds of keyboards faded away into nothingness. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the massive room like a dark cloud. I could feel dozens of pairs of judgmental eyes burning into the side of my face and my back. I kept my chin pointed straight up, trying desperately to maintain whatever tiny shred of dignity I had left, but the sheer public humiliation was suffocating me. I heard cruel whispers rippling through the glass cubicles as we walked past. People were blatantly pointing at me. A younger woman standing by the water cooler gasped softly as I was paraded past her desk like a common thief. It was without a doubt the most degrading and emotionally violent experience of my entire 35 years of existence. The security guards did not even let me take the regular passenger elevators back down to the main floor. They escorted me down a narrow hallway to the concrete freight elevator in the back of the building, ensuring I was entirely removed from their pristine professional ecosystem like a dangerous virus. When the heavy metal elevator doors finally closed, shutting out the staring faces of the corporate elite, I leaned heavily against the cold steel wall and let out a shaky, ragged breath. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Someone was actively and maliciously sabotaging my life. Someone was watching my career moves, tracking my interviews, and waiting for the exact moment I was about to succeed before pulling the rug out from under me to watch me fall. I was not just going to walk out to my car and cry in the parking lot. I was going to find out exactly who was destroying my livelihood. As the freight elevator rapidly descended to the ground floor, my overwhelming sadness morphed into a sharp, blinding, and calculated anger. I marched out of the corporate building, but I did not head for the transit station. I stood firmly on the busy concrete sidewalk, gripping my leather portfolio tightly to my chest, and waited. I needed answers immediately, and I knew exactly who I was going to corner to get them. I knew the external recruiter who set up this interview would be leaving the building soon. Her name was Lauren, and she was an independent headhunter who had spent weeks hyping up my professional profile to Mr. Harrison. I slipped past the main plaza security desk and made my way down the steep concrete ramp into the dimly lit executive parking garage. The air down there was thick with the smell of vehicle exhaust and damp concrete. I paced between the rows of expensive imported cars, my heels echoing sharply in the cavernous underground space. I was not leaving this building without the absolute truth. I refused to let some invisible hand choke the life out of my career while I just stood by and played the helpless victim. After 40 agonizing minutes, the heavy metal door leading from the private elevator lobby finally swung open. Lauren walked out clutching her designer tote bag and looking completely exhausted. She clicked her key fob and the headlights of a sleek silver sedan flashed a few yards away. I stepped out from behind a thick concrete pillar blocking her path to the driver's side door. Lauren jumped back, clutching her hand to her chest. Her eyes went wide with sheer panic the moment she recognized me standing in the shadows. "Zuri, please, you cannot be down here," she stammered, taking a quick step backward. "Building security is already on high alert looking for you. If they catch me talking to you, it could completely compromise my recruiting contract with the entire firm. I cannot be involved in whatever legal mess your family has you tangled up in." I did not raise my voice, but I stepped closer, narrowing the distance between us. "I am not in a legal mess, Lauren," I said firmly, my voice steady and low. "I am a victim of character assassination, and you know it. We spent 2 months preparing for this placement. You vetted my entire background yourself. You ran the standard criminal checks. You verified my professional references. My record is completely spotless. You know I am the absolute best candidate Mr. Harrison has seen all year. So tell me exactly what happened up in that boardroom." Lauren looked around the empty parking garage, nervously chewing on her lower lip. Her professional corporate facade was cracking under the heavy weight of her own guilt. She had built a friendly relationship with me over the phone, and we both knew she was throwing me to the wolves just to save her own commission check. "I have strict confidentiality agreements, Zuri," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They will sue me into oblivion if I share internal communications with a rejected candidate. Please just go home. Move to another city. Start over somewhere else where nobody knows your name. Start over somewhere else." I repeated the words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. Why would I need to flee my own city, Lauren? What exactly did Mr. Harrison see on his computer that made him treat me like a wanted fugitive? I took another step forward, locking my eyes directly onto hers. "I am a forensic auditor. I spend my entire life unearthing buried secrets for a living. Do you really think I will just let this go? I will file an official defamation lawsuit by tomorrow morning, and I will subpoena every single email communication your agency had with this firm. You will be sitting in a deposition room explaining under oath why you blacklisted a perfectly qualified candidate without any valid cause. Or you can just tell me the truth right now and keep yourself out of the crossfire." The threat of a messy legal battle made the color completely drain from her face. She let out a long, shaky sigh, her shoulders slumping in deep defeat. "It was not a standard background check, Zuri," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The firm did not go digging for dirt on you. The dirt was delivered directly to them. It was delivered to every major financial institution in the entire downtown district." She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out her silver tablet. Her hands were shaking violently as she tapped the bright screen, bringing up her encrypted corporate email application. She swiped through a few messages before stopping on one specific long thread. She handed the tablet over to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of deep pity and disbelief. I took the device, my heart hammering relentlessly against my ribs. The email was flagged with a bright red exclamation point for high importance. It was addressed to the managing directors and hiring managers of over 20 elite financial firms across the city. The subject line read, "Confidential notice regarding Zuri and corporate theft." I felt the warm blood turn to freezing ice in my veins before I even read the body of the message. I scrolled down the screen and my eyes locked onto the sender address. It was not a disgruntled former coworker or a jealous industry competitor. The sender was Desmond, my own father. The signature block at the bottom of the email proudly displayed his brand new title, Interim Chief Executive Officer of Elijah Holdings. He had taken over my grandfather's company, and he was aggressively using its massive corporate weight to crush my entire existence. I read the text of the email, and every single word felt like a physical knife twisting deeply into my back. To whom it may concern, it began. As the acting CEO of Elijah Holdings, it is my unfortunate ethical duty to warn our peers in the financial sector regarding a former employee and family member. Zuri recently departed our family enterprise under highly disturbing circumstances. Internal audits have revealed that she systematically embezzled exactly $250,000 from our operational accounts over the past fiscal year. Because she is family, we have chosen to handle this matter privately and have not yet involved law enforcement. However, we cannot in good conscience allow her to infiltrate another financial institution and put your corporate assets at risk. We strongly advise against offering her employment in any capacity handling sensitive financial data. I stared at the glowing screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My own father had written this horrific lie. The man who raised me, the man who sat at the head of our dining table and constantly preached about family loyalty and protecting our own blood. He had sat down at his expensive mahogany desk, drafted a meticulously calculated lie, and blasted it across my entire professional industry. He did not just want to fire me from the family business. He wanted to make absolutely sure that I starved in the streets. He wanted to ensure that I could never rebuild my life or find financial success anywhere else. But why, I whispered, staring blankly at the screen. The numbers did not make any logical sense. $250,000. That was a highly specific amount of money. If my father was just trying to ruin my reputation, he could have vaguely accused me of incompetence or gross insubordination. Accusing me of stealing $250,000 was a very dangerous legal game, especially when there was absolutely zero proof to back it up. I handed the tablet back to Lauren. She took it quickly, slipping it back into her bag, as if the device itself were on fire. "I am so sorry, Zuri," she said softly, looking down at the concrete floor. When a warning comes directly from the CEO of a company as massive as Elijah Holdings, no hiring manager is ever going to risk ignoring it. They do not care if it is a complete lie. The corporate world avoids legal liability at all costs. You are completely radioactive right now. Nobody in this city is going to hire you. I did not respond to her. I could barely hear her voice over the roaring sound of my own racing pulse in my ears. The scattered pieces of a massive puzzle were violently snapping into place inside my mind. My sudden exclusion from family gatherings over the last few months. The cold, glaring looks from my mother Brenda. The arrogant, mocking smirks from my sister Jasmine and her husband Terrence. They had not just pushed me out of the family circle because they disliked me. They had actively framed me for a massive corporate theft. I thanked Lauren for her honesty and turned away, walking back up the steep concrete ramp toward the blinding daylight of the city streets. My mind was racing, analyzing the situation with the cold, mechanical precision of the auditor I was highly trained to be. They had accused me of taking exactly $250,000. The number kept repeating in my head like a broken record. I stepped out onto the bustling pavement of the financial district. The world around me was moving at its usual frantic pace, but I was frozen in a completely different reality. The gravity of what my father had done was suffocating. He had weaponized his vast professional network to actively hunt down my job applications. He must have had someone monitoring my digital footprint just to find out exactly where I was interviewing. I walked toward the dusty municipal lot where my aging sedan was parked. As I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, I pulled my phone from my purse. I opened my banking app and stared at the miserable balance. I had exactly $3,000 left to my name. 6 months of targeted unemployment had completely drained my savings account. Meanwhile, my sister Jasmine had just posted a video on social media yesterday, flaunting a brand new $120,000 Porsche, laughing about how truly blessed her life was. The contrast was sickening. I gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned pure white. My own flesh and blood had systematically dismantled my life and watched me suffer from the supreme comfort of their gated luxury estate. They thought I would just quietly fade away and accept my total defeat. But they had severely underestimated the woman they had cast out into the cold. I was not a weak little girl anymore. I was a senior financial auditor, and my entire existence was dedicated to finding the truth hidden beneath thick layers of deceit. I sat in the stifling heat of my aging sedan, letting the engine idle, while the magnitude of the betrayal washed over me. The email from my father was not just a warning to potential employers, it was a calculated execution of my independence. As I stared blankly through the dusty windshield, my mind began connecting the financial discrepancies I had noticed over the past few months. My sister Jasmine had never worked a legitimate 40-hour week in her entire 32 years of life. She held a vanity title as the director of lifestyle branding at our family real estate firm. Yet just yesterday she had posted a video online dripping in designer clothing, holding the keys to a custom-ordered $120,000 Porsche. She had captioned it saying, "Hard work always pays off." Her husband Terrence was an arrogant man whose last 3 cryptocurrency startups had completely imploded, leaving behind a trail of angry investors. Neither of them had the legitimate income to support their sudden explosion of wealth. While I was meticulously counting my last $3,000, checking my bank app daily, and rationing my groceries, they were living like royalty. And they were funding that lifestyle by pinning a massive corporate theft directly onto my name. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the municipal lot. I did not know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I could not spend another second sitting in silence. I merged onto the interstate, heading north out of the city, toward the affluent gated communities where my parents lived. The drive took 45 minutes, but it felt like 5. My mind was operating like a supercomputer, processing every interaction I had with my parents since grandfather Elijah passed away. When the doctors first diagnosed him with early onset dementia, my father Desmond quickly positioned himself as the sole protector of the family assets. He took over the company operations and completely shut me out of the financial review meetings. I had assumed he was just being protective of his father's legacy. I had stepped back out of respect for the family hierarchy. Now I realized he was building a fortress to hide his own corruption. Grandfather Elijah had built his empire from nothing, working 12-hour days in the brutal Chicago winters to secure our family name. He was the only person in that massive house who ever truly saw me. When my mother Brenda would criticize my practical clothes or my intense focus on my studies, Grandfather Elijah would quietly hand me another book on economics and tell me that a sharp mind was the only asset nobody could ever repossess. He would have been absolutely disgusted to see his own son weaponizing his legacy to destroy his granddaughter. My tires gripped the pavement as I took the exit toward the sprawling suburban estates. The trees grew taller and the properties grew massive. This was the world I was raised in but never truly belonged to. I was always the scapegoat, the one who asked too many questions, the one who insisted on doing things by the book instead of relying on family privilege to clear the path. They resented my independence, and now they were actively trying to crush it. I approached the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' exclusive neighborhood. The security guard in the booth was new. He did not recognize my vehicle and held up his hand, signaling me to stop. I did not have the patience for protocol today. I rolled down my window and confidently stated my last name, instructing him to check the permanent resident access list. He fumbled with his clipboard, found my name, and pressed the heavy green button to open the iron gates. I drove through the winding, manicured streets where every lawn looked like a professional golf course. I finally reached the massive stone driveway of my childhood home. But I was forced to hit the brakes before I could even pull up to the front door. The sprawling circular driveway was completely packed with luxury vehicles. There were 3 pristine white catering vans parked near the side entrance, with chefs in crisp white uniforms carrying silver trays of food into the house. A professional valet stand was set up near the front steps, with 2 attendants rushing to park a steady stream of incoming Mercedes and Range Rovers. Warm golden light poured from every massive window of the 3-story colonial house. I could hear the faint, elegant notes of a live string quartet drifting through the cool evening air. I pulled my old sedan over to the grassy shoulder of the road and turned off the engine. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Today was the 20th of the month. It was the exact date my mother Brenda had originally mentioned for grandfather Elijah's memorial dinner. Just 2 weeks ago, she had called me acting incredibly distressed. She had told me the family was simply too emotionally exhausted to host a gathering, and that the entire event had been indefinitely postponed. She had looked right into the camera during our video call, wiping away a fake tear, and said, "We just need more time to grieve in private." Yet here I was staring at a massive catered event dripping in wealth and exclusivity. They had not postponed the memorial dinner. They had simply uninvited me. They were throwing a lavish celebration of my grandfather's life, and they had systematically ensured that his only decent grandchild was locked out in the cold. I watched through my windshield as Terrence stepped out onto the front porch, wearing a custom-tailored suit, holding a glass of expensive champagne. He was laughing loudly at something another guest said, looking completely carefree and untouched by the world. The man who was drowning in debt just a few months ago was now standing on the porch of a multi-million-dollar estate, toasting to the patriarch he had robbed. Behind him, I could see the silhouette of my sister Jasmine through the glass front door, wearing a stunning black designer gown and greeting guests with her signature fake smile. I felt a cold, dangerous calm settle deep into my bones. I was not going to drive away and cry in my empty apartment. I was not going to send an angry text message to my mother and wait for a gaslighting explanation that would never come. They had dragged my professional name through the mud. They had stolen my career. They had tried to erase my existence from this family, so they could feast on my grandfather's legacy like vultures. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you corner a forensic auditor who has absolutely nothing left to lose. I reached over to the passenger seat, grabbed my leather portfolio, and stepped out of the car into the crisp evening air. I adjusted my navy blue suit jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles from the drive. I did not care that I was not wearing an expensive designer gown, or that my presence would ruin their perfectly curated evening. I marched up the long stone walkway, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement with every step. I was going to crash this party, and I was going to make sure every single person in that house saw exactly who they were dealing with. The young valet attendant in the crisp white uniform stepped right into my path as I marched up the sweeping stone driveway. He held up a white-gloved hand, his eyes scanning my practical navy blue business suit with clear hesitation. He politely informed me that this was a private, heavily secured event and asked to see my formal invitation. I did not break my stride for a single second. I looked right through him and told him my last name was engraved on the massive stone pillars at the end of the driveway, and he had exactly 3 seconds to step aside before I had his employment contract terminated. He blinked in surprise and quickly stepped back onto the manicured grass, allowing me to pass. I was not playing by their polite, high society rules anymore. The gloves were entirely off. I reached the massive solid oak front doors of the estate. They were propped wide open to let the cool evening breeze circulate through the grand foyer. I stepped over the marble threshold and was immediately hit by a wall of sensory overload. The sheer amount of money being burned in this single room was absolutely staggering. Towering arrangements of imported white lilies and orchids were positioned on every available surface. A professional string quartet was tucked into the corner of the sweeping grand staircase, playing a delicate and mournful classical piece. Waiters in tailored black tuxedos floated silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar appetizers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive designer perfumes and roasted meats. It was a flawless, breathtaking display of immense wealth. It was also completely insulting to the man they were supposedly mourning. Grandfather Elijah was a man who drank cheap black coffee from a thermos and wore the same scuffed work boots for 10 years. He would have been absolutely sickened to see his legacy being celebrated with such vulgar, pretentious excess. I stepped fully into the bright golden light of the main dining room. The space was packed with dozens of the most powerful and influential people in the city. There were local politicians, prominent real estate developers, and wealthy socialites. Everyone was dressed in perfectly tailored black mourning attire, wearing expressions of practiced, elegant sorrow. And then there was me, standing right in the center of the arched doorway, wearing my practical navy blue work suit, holding a battered leather portfolio. The reaction was almost immediate. It started with the guest standing closest to the entrance. A wealthy property developer I recognized from my childhood turned his head and froze mid-sentence. His wife followed his gaze, and her perfectly manicured hand fluttered up to cover her mouth in a quiet gasp. The silence began to spread outward from the doorway like a heavy stone dropped into a completely still pond. The quiet, elegant murmurs of conversation simply evaporated. One by one, the guests turned to stare at the disgraced daughter who had dared to show her face. The rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses being set down on silver trays ceased entirely. Within 10 seconds, the entire grand dining room was suffocatingly quiet, with only the oblivious string quartet still playing their delicate music in the background. The collective weight of their judgment pressed down on my shoulders, but I simply lifted my chin higher, locking my knees so they would not shake. From across the massive room, I saw my parents. Desmond and Brenda were standing near the grand stone fireplace holding court with a group of wealthy investors. When my father noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy, he turned his head. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, the charming, grieving host facade melted completely off his face. His jaw clenched so hard I could practically see the muscles jumping in his cheek. Beside him, my mother Brenda went entirely rigid. Her eyes widened in absolute panic as she registered my presence. They did not look like parents seeing their child. They looked like criminals who had just spotted a federal agent walking into their hideout. They excused themselves from the investors with tight, unnatural smiles and began moving rapidly across the dining room floor. They practically shoved past a state senator in their desperate rush to intercept me before I could take another step deeper into the party. They descended on me like a pair of frantic predators. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, my father grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug viciously into my bicep through the fabric of my suit jacket. His grip was punishing and entirely intended to cause physical pain. He roughly pulled me out of the bright main dining room and shoved me backward into the shadows of the adjacent library hallway. My mother followed right on his heels, immediately stepping in front of me to create a solid physical wall between me and the wealthy guests in the other room. "What the hell are you doing here?" Desmond hissed, his voice, a low, dangerous rumble vibrating in his chest. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wide and frantic. He maintained a frozen, horrifying smile on his face, just in case anyone from the dining room was still watching us, but his tone was laced with pure venom. "You were explicitly excluded from the security list. I told the guards at the gate to call the police if you tried to breach the perimeter." I looked down at the hand currently bruising my arm, and then looked back up into his panicked eyes. "Take your hand off me right now," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. I did not yell. I did not shrink back. I spoke with the absolute authority of a woman who knew exactly how much power she actually held. Desmond hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised by my total lack of fear, before slowly uncurling his fingers and dropping his hand to his side. My mother, Brenda, leaned in close, her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the light, sparkling brilliantly as she breathed heavily. "How dare you show your face in this house?" she spat, her words sharp and breathless. "Have you not embarrassed this family enough? Have you not done enough damage to your grandfather's legacy? You have absolute nerve walking in here after what you did." I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a profound sense of emptiness where my daughterly affection used to be. "After what I did," I repeated, tilting my head slightly. "You mean after I spent 6 months meticulously preparing a corporate risk assessment while you two were busy trying to figure out how to frame me for your own financial mess?" Brenda's eyes flared with intense rage. "Do not you dare stand there and play the victim, Zuri," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "We know exactly what you did with the corporate accounts. We have the internal reports. You are nothing but a common criminal. You spent your entire life acting like you were better than everyone else in this family, acting like you were the only one who cared about hard work. And the second Elijah got sick, you started draining his operational funds to line your own pockets. You are a disgrace. You are stealing from a dying man. The absolute audacity of her words felt like a physical slap to the face. She was standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion, wearing $50,000 worth of diamonds, throwing a lavish party funded by my grandfather's hard-earned money while accusing me of being a thief. The psychological projection was so massive, it was almost difficult to comprehend. They had repeated this lie to each other so many times, they were actually starting to believe it themselves. They needed me to be the villain, so they could sleep peacefully at night in their stolen luxury beds. I am going to give you exactly one chance to turn around and walk quietly out that front door, Desmond warned, stepping closer to physically intimidate me. His chest puffed out, his entire posture screaming for dominance. If you make a scene in front of my guests, I will have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs. And I promise you, Zuri, I will personally make sure the judge throws you in a concrete cell for the $250,000 you embezzled. You are already radioactive in the corporate world. Do not make me destroy your personal freedom, too. He was using the exact same authoritative tone he used to close massive real estate deals. He expected me to crumble. He expected the family scapegoat to lower her eyes, apologize for existing, and run back out into the darkness. But I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground in the dimly lit hallway, planting my feet firmly onto the expensive Persian rug. You cannot destroy something that you never controlled to begin with, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the narrow corridor. And you do not get to throw a party celebrating a man whose life work you are actively dismantling. Brenda let out a sharp, breathless laugh of disbelief, shaking her head. You are completely delusional, she muttered. She turned to Desmond, touching his arm frantically. Go get the security team from the back gate, Desmond. Do not even argue with her anymore. Get her out of my house before she ruins this entire evening. But before Desmond could turn around to signal the guards, the heavy wooden doors of the library swung open behind them. The situation was about to escalate from a quiet, private confrontation into a full-blown public spectacle. Because the Golden Child had finally decided to make her grand entrance. The heavy mahogany doors of the library pushed open wider, casting a long wedge of warm golden light across the dark Persian rug. Jasmine stood in the doorway, perfectly framed like a high-fashion photograph. She was wearing a custom black silk gown that draped flawlessly over her figure, her hair styled in soft, elegant waves. She looked every inch the grieving yet stoic granddaughter of a real estate tycoon. Right behind her stood her husband Terrence, looking impossibly smug in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a half-empty crystal flute of champagne. Jasmine did not walk into the room, she glided. She moved with the effortless entitlement of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. As soon as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the suffocating tension emanating from my parents instantly vanished. Desmond dropped his rigid posture, and Brenda actually let out an audible sigh of relief. The Golden Child had arrived to handle the unpleasant mess that they could not contain. Jasmine stopped a few feet in front of me, tilting her head to the side with a perfectly practiced look of deep pity. She did not yell like my parents had. She knew that true cruelty did not require raising your voice. She purposely left the library doors propped open just enough so the wealthy guests lingering near the grand staircase could hear every single word she was about to say. Zuri, what on earth are you doing here? Jasmine asked, her voice dripping with fake honey and manufactured concern. This is a private memorial for family and close friends to grieve in peace. You know you are not supposed to be anywhere near this property. Dad already had the estate attorneys draw up the perimeter paperwork. Are you trying to get yourself arrested in front of the mayor and the city council? I looked at my older sister taking in the glittering diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. A bracelet I knew for a fact cost more than my entire college tuition. I am here because I am Elijah's granddaughter, I replied, my voice perfectly calm and resonant. And last time I checked, he loved me just as much as he loved you, Jasmine. Perhaps even more, considering I never asked him to fund my lifestyle. Jasmine's fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her perfectly manicured fingers twitching at her sides. She despised any reminder that grandfather Elijah had respected my work ethic, while he merely tolerated her endless shopping sprees. But she quickly recovered, bringing a hand to her chest, as if I had just physically struck her. "How can you even say his name after what you did to his company?" she whispered loudly enough for the hallway to echo. "You broke his heart, Zuri. You drained his operational accounts while he was lying in a hospital bed losing his memory. You took advantage of a dying man. We are all trying to heal from the horrific financial mess you left behind, and you have the absolute audacity to show up here in a cheap suit and demand a seat at the table. You are sick. You really need professional psychiatric help." The gaslighting was so intense, it was almost mesmerizing to witness. She delivered the lines flawlessly, like a seasoned stage actress. If I did not know the absolute truth about the stolen money, I might have actually believed her performance myself. She was weaponizing my grandfather's dementia to paint herself as the protective victim while simultaneously wearing his stolen assets on her wrist. Before I could dismantle her ridiculous monologue, Terrence decided it was his turn to play the protective alpha male. He handed his champagne glass to Jasmine and stepped forward, physically inserting himself between me and my sister. Terrence was a tall man who relied entirely on intimidation and expensive cologne to mask his deep-seated insecurities. He had failed out of 3 consecutive cryptocurrency ventures, burning through millions of dollars of investor capital, but he walked around this estate acting like he was a self-made billionaire. "Listen to me very carefully, Zuri," he said, puffing out his chest and looking down his nose at me. "Jasmine is far too polite to say what actually needs to be said right now. You are a complete embarrassment. You are a toxic stain on this family name, and you are completely ruining my wife's evening. We have governors and state senators in that dining room right now. We do not have time to deal with a disgruntled, unemployed criminal throwing a temper tantrum in the hallway." I looked Terrence slowly up and down, noting the custom stitching on his lapels and the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist. "It is fascinating to hear you talk about toxic stains, Terrence," I said, keeping my tone conversational and light. "Especially coming from a man who had his business bank accounts frozen by the Federal Trade Commission just 6 months ago. How is that silent settlement going, by the way? Did you manage to pay off those angry investors, or are they still threatening to sue you for fraud?" Terrence's face flushed a deep, angry purple. I had hit the exact nerve I was aiming for. His fake bravado instantly dissolved into raw, volatile anger. He took a threatening step forward, invading my personal space. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. My father Desmond quickly stepped up behind Terrence, ready to back him up if things turned physical. I was completely surrounded by 4 people who deeply hated me, but I did not take a single step backward. "You think you are so incredibly smart? Do you not?" Terrence sneered, his upper lip curling into a nasty snarl. "You think because you sit behind a computer looking at spreadsheets all day that you understand how the real world works. You understand absolutely nothing. You are a broke, pathetic little girl who got caught stealing from her own family. And now you are standing here begging for scraps because nobody in this entire city will ever hire you again." He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip. It was stuffed with crisp $100 bills, a deliberate and flashy display of wealth that screamed of new money arrogance. He peeled back the top layers and slid out a single $50 bill. He held it up between his index and middle finger, waving it slightly in the air in front of my face. "We know you are completely broke, Zuri," he said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "We know you have been living off instant noodles for the last 6 months because your father made sure your career was completely dead and buried. So here is what is going to happen." Terrence let go of the $50 bill. We all watched in silence as the green paper fluttered through the air back and forth until it landed gently on the dark, intricate patterns of the Persian rug, right at the pointed toe of my navy blue heel. "Pick that up," Terence commanded, pointing at the floor. "Pick it up, walk out the front door, and call yourself an Uber. Go back to whatever miserable little apartment you live in and never show your face near this family again. We did not budget a plate for thieves tonight." Jasmine let out a soft, cruel laugh from behind him. Brenda crossed her arms over her chest, looking at me with a mixture of triumph and supreme disgust. They had executed their ultimate power play. They had physically humiliated me, financially, degraded me, and forcefully asserted their total dominance over my existence in front of an audience. They expected me to break down in tears. They expected the crushing weight of the public insult to finally shatter my resolve. They waited for me to bend down and pick up the scrap of money they had so generously thrown at my feet. I looked down at the $50 bill resting on the carpet. The silence in the hallway was deafening. Even the string quartet in the other room seemed to have paused between songs. I could feel the eyes of the wealthy guests burning into my back from the open doorway. This was the exact moment that would define the rest of my life. I could either shrink into the floor and accept the role of the defeated scapegoat, or I could stand tall and burn their entire fabricated empire to the ground. I did not bend down. I did not cry. I did not even blink. Instead, I slowly lifted my foot and stepped directly onto the center of the $50 bill, grinding the heel of my shoe into the crisp paper. I looked back up at Terence, locking my eyes onto his. The arrogant smirk on his face began to waver under the sheer intensity of my stare. He realized in that split second that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with the helpless younger sister they had manipulated for years. He had no idea he was standing face to face with the senior forensic auditor who was already holding the match to light his entire life on fire. I kept my heel firmly planted on his crumpled $50 bill. The arrogant sneer on Terence's face melted into a look of absolute confusion and rising panic. He was a bully who only knew how to operate when his victims cowered. When faced with absolute defiance, he had no script left to follow. I slowly unzipped the top of my battered leather portfolio. The distinct sound of the metal zipper echoed sharply in the tense quiet of the hallway. My mother, Brenda, took a nervous step backward, clutching her diamond necklace as if I were about to pull out a weapon. In a way, I was. I reached inside and withdrew the single sheet of printer paper that Lauren the recruiter had given me earlier that morning. I unfolded it with slow, deliberate precision. I did not raise my voice to a hysterical scream. I did not need to. I spoke with the crisp, clear projection of a senior auditor presenting irrefutable evidence to a hostile board of directors. I knew exactly how to make my voice carry over the soft classical music playing in the adjacent room. I looked directly at my father. "I see you have been incredibly busy since taking over as interim chief executive, Desmond," I said, holding up the piece of paper. "I am holding a printed copy of a highly confidential email you sent to over 20 major financial institutions across the city this week. In it, you claim that I systematically embezzled exactly $250,000 from grandfather Elijah's operational accounts. You told my prospective employers that I was a dangerous corporate thief and strongly advised them to terminate my candidacy immediately." My father's face drained of all color. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the paper from my hand, but I smoothly stepped just out of his reach. The wealthy guests lingering near the grand staircase had completely stopped pretending not to listen. The heavy word embezzled hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several people actually gasped. I turned my sharp focus away from my panicked father and locked my eyes back onto my brother-in-law. Terence was sweating. A single bead of moisture rolled down his perfectly groomed temple. $250,000, I announced, letting the number ring out through the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "It is such a highly specific number, is it not, Terence?" Most corporate thieves steal in fractured amounts, covering their tracks with randomized withdrawals. But this was exactly $250,000 in one massive sweeping sum. Jasmine moved closer to her husband, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly. "Stop talking right now, Zuri," she hissed, her voice tight with panic. "You are making a complete fool of yourself. Everyone here thinks you are insane." I ignored her completely, stepping closer to Terrence. I tilted my head, studying him like a fascinating insect trapped under a microscope. "Tell me, Terrence," I said, my tone deceptively conversational. "How much did it cost to settle that massive class action lawsuit last October? You know, the one I am talking about. The lawsuit where dozens of early investors accused your latest cryptocurrency startup of being a fraudulent pump and dump scheme. You fought it for months until the Federal Trade Commission started asking questions. And then suddenly, you managed to secure a private out-of-court settlement with an airtight non-disclosure agreement." Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. His eyes darted frantically toward my father, seeking a rescue that was not going to come. "Let me refresh your memory," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a surgical scalpel. "You wired the settlement funds to a corporate mediator based in Delaware, and the exact dollar amount required to keep you out of federal prison and save this family from a massive public scandal was exactly $250,000, down to the very last cent." The reaction was instantaneous and violently physical. All the remaining color vanished from Terrence's face. His fingers simply stopped working. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped straight through his grip. It fell in slow motion, hitting the polished hardwood floor just inches away from the Persian rug. The glass shattered into 100 glittering pieces, sending a wave of expensive vintage champagne splashing across the toes of his custom Italian leather shoes. The sharp, shattering sound acted like a gunshot in the silent house. In the main dining room, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-measure. The sudden, absolute silence that followed was deafening. Every single guest in the mansion, from the wealthy property developers to the local politicians, was now staring directly at our family. I had just publicly accused the Golden Child's husband of federal fraud and exposed my father's desperate cover-up in front of the most powerful people in the city. The perfectly curated facade of the grieving wealthy family was completely destroyed. My father, Desmond, completely lost his mind. His carefully maintained image of the stoic wealthy patriarch shattered right alongside the crystal glass. He spun around wildly, his face burning a bright, violent shade of red. He threw his arms up in the air, frantically signaling the two large security guards stationed near the front entrance. "Get her out of here!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with pure rage and absolute humiliation. "I want her physically removed from my property right this second. Call the local precinct and have her arrested for trespassing." The two security guards in dark suits immediately started jogging across the marble foyer toward us. I did not panic. I did not run. I calmly folded the printed email and tucked it safely back inside my leather portfolio. I had achieved exactly what I came here to do. I had planted the seed of absolute doubt. Every single business partner and investor in that dining room would now be quietly questioning my father's integrity and looking very closely at Terrence's sudden influx of cash. As the guards closed the distance, Jasmine grabbed Terrence's arm, pulling him back from the shattered glass. She stepped directly into my space, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. The sweet, elegant sister act was completely gone, leaving only the vicious, entitled bully underneath. "You think you just won something, do you not?" she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for my ears. "You think making a scene makes you look smart? You are nothing, Zuri. You are a bitter, broke little girl who cannot handle the fact that she was always second best." She leaned in closer, her designer perfume suffocating me. "Go ahead and enjoy your little moment of revenge tonight," she mocked, her eyes gleaming with dark triumph. "Because you have absolutely no idea what is coming." Grandfather's final will is being officially read this Friday morning at 10 o'clock at the estate lawyer's office, and Dad already had the legal team draft a barring order against you. You are legally prohibited from even stepping foot inside the building. She smiled a cruel, jagged smile. We are taking the entire company, Zuri. We are taking the estate, the investment portfolios, and every last dime he ever made. You get absolutely nothing. So go ahead and walk out that door. You are dead to this family. I looked at my sister, taking in her desperate need to crush me. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt a deep, icy clarity. The security guards reached me, placing their heavy hands on my shoulders to escort me out. I easily shrugged off their grip, shooting them a cold warning look that told them I was leaving on my own terms. I looked down at the crushed $50 bill still resting under my shoe. I stepped off it, leaving the dirty, crumpled paper on their pristine rug. "I will see you on Friday, Jasmine," I said softly, my voice radiating absolute certainty. I turned my back on my family. I did not look at the staring guests or the shattered glass. I walked out the massive front doors of the estate, descending the stone steps into the cool night air. My career was currently in ruins, and my family had just publicly cast me out. But as I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward my old sedan, a fierce, triumphant smile finally broke across my face. They thought they had successfully buried me. They had no idea I already had my hands on the shovel. The drive back to the city was a blur of highway lights and roaring wind. I kept the windows of my old sedan rolled all the way down, letting the freezing night air rush in to cool the adrenaline pumping furiously through my veins. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached, but my mind was completely clear. For the first time in 6 months, I was not sitting in the dark, wondering why my life was falling apart. I knew exactly who my enemies were, and I had looked them dead in the eyes. I had dropped a massive bomb in the middle of their perfect high society memorial dinner and walked away. But I also knew my family. Desmond and Brenda were obsessed with control. Jasmine and Terrence were driven by vicious entitlement. They were not going to just sit around the ruins of their shattered crystal glasses and let me have the last word. A wounded animal is always the most dangerous, and I had just backed 4 of them into a corner at the same time. I knew a counterattack was coming. I just did not expect them to execute it before I even made it back home. I pulled into the cramped, uncovered parking lot of my modest brick apartment building on the south side of the city. It was a far cry from the sprawling gated estates of my childhood. The yellow streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. I gathered my purse and my leather portfolio from the passenger seat, locked the car doors, and began the long walk up 3 flights of concrete stairs to my unit. My legs felt heavy with exhaustion. The emotional toll of the confrontation was finally starting to catch up with me. All I wanted to do was take a hot shower, brew a strong cup of black tea, and open my laptop to start digging into the corporate tax filings of Elijah Holdings. When I reached the 3rd-floor landing, my eyes immediately caught a flash of bright neon orange in the dim hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks. Taped directly to the center of my dark wooden door was a thick piece of legal paper. It was not a missed delivery slip or a friendly note from a neighbor. It was an official municipal document. I closed the distance down the narrow hallway, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. I reached out and ripped the orange paper from the door. The bold black letters across the top of the page screamed at me in heavy print. Official notice to vacate. 3-day unconditional quit. I stared at the document, completely bewildered. I had lived in this apartment for 3 years. I was a senior financial auditor. I budgeted my life down to the very last penny. Even after being unemployed for 6 months, I had prioritized my rent above food and utilities. My rent was paid in full, and I had the bank receipts to prove it. I scanned the dense legal jargon printed beneath the bold heading, looking for an explanation. The document stated that the ownership of the building had recently been transferred to a new corporate entity. According to a heavily buried clause in my original lease agreement, a new property owner had the legal right to terminate month-to-month tenancies with an expedited 3-day notice if they intended to perform massive structural renovations. The paper claimed my unit was scheduled for immediate demolition and gutting. I was ordered to surrender the keys and vacate the premises entirely within 72 hours, or face a forced eviction by the county sheriff's department. At the bottom of the page was the signature of the new property management company, Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. I had never heard of the company in my life. It sounded exactly like the kind of generic, faceless shell corporation real estate developers use to quickly flip distressed properties. I unlocked my door and stepped into my dark apartment, tossing my keys onto the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was not out of fear. It was out of sheer blazing anger. Someone was aggressively trying to render me homeless. Before I could even reach for the light switch, my cell phone vibrated violently inside my purse. The sudden buzzing sound made me jump. I pulled the phone out and looked at the glowing screen. I had a new text message. It was from a number I had deliberately blocked months ago, but the sender had clearly used a temporary digital number to bypass the restriction. I opened the message. There were no polite greetings. It was just a high-resolution photograph followed by 2 short sentences. I tapped the screen to enlarge the photograph. It was a picture of a certified municipal property deed. The document officially recorded the sale of my exact apartment building located on the south side of the city. The buyer listed on the deed was Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. But what made the blood freeze entirely in my veins was the signature scrawled at the bottom of the page acting as the authorized managing member of the LLC. It was Terrence. My arrogant, desperately insecure brother-in-law had not just insulted me at the party. While I was driving home, he had called his aggressive real estate brokers and authorized the emergency purchase of my entire apartment complex. He had leveraged his connections to bypass the usual 30-day closing period, pushing through a rapid cash transaction just to acquire the building I lived in. He spent millions of dollars on a mediocre residential property for the sole purpose of taping an orange eviction notice to my front door. I swiped out of the photograph and read the text message attached below it. Checkmate. Stay away from the reading on Friday or I press criminal charges for the $250,000. You have 3 days to pack your garbage and get out of my building. I stood in the dark kitchen, the pale blue light of the cell phone screen illuminating my face. The absolute audacity of his move was staggering. He thought he had completely destroyed me. He thought the threat of impending homelessness combined with the threat of federal criminal charges would break my spirit. He expected me to fall to my knees, pack my bags, and disappear into the night before the estate lawyers opened my grandfather's will on Friday morning. Terrence thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. But Terrence was a man who failed out of 3 startups because he never understood the actual mechanics of money. He only understood the illusion of power. I let out a low, sharp laugh that echoed in the empty apartment. I walked over to the kitchen island and turned on the overhead lights. I did not start pulling cardboard boxes out of the closet. I did not look around my apartment and cry over losing my home. I walked straight to my work desk and pulled my high-powered laptop from my bag. Terrence thought he had handed me a death sentence, but what he actually handed me was a master key. As a forensic auditor, I knew that money never simply materialized out of thin air. It always leaves a trail. Terrence was completely broke 6 months ago. His bank accounts had been frozen by federal regulators after his last cryptocurrency disaster. Yet tonight, he was standing in a custom suit throwing $50 bills on the floor. And more importantly, he had just executed a massive real estate transaction to buy an entire apartment complex in cash under a brand new LLC. Where did that sudden massive influx of capital come from? He certainly did not get a traditional bank loan with his abysmal credit history. He was so blinded by his bruised ego and his desperate need to punish me for humiliating him at the party that he made a fatal tactical error. By purchasing this building and aggressively linking his name to the LLC Through that text message, he had officially connected his personal finances to a tangible corporate asset. He gave me a definitive starting point, a thread I could grab onto and pull until his entire fabricated empire unraveled. I sat down in my ergonomic desk chair and flipped open the laptop. The screen glowed brightly, warming my face as I booted up my encrypted auditing software. Terrence wanted to threaten me with criminal charges for a fabricated theft. He wanted to throw me out onto the street. He thought the game was over. I cracked my knuckles, staring intensely at the blinking cursor on the screen. The eviction notice on my door meant absolutely nothing to me now. I had exactly 3 days until the will reading on Friday. 3 days to dissect every single financial move Terrence and my sister had made over the last 2 years. I was going to follow the money funding Apex Horizon Holdings LLC, and I was going to find out exactly how much of my grandfather's legacy they had actually stolen. I typed my complex administrative password into the database and pressed enter. The game was not over. It was just beginning. The glowing screen of my laptop was the only light in my dark apartment. The ambient noise of the city streets outside faded into complete silence as I locked myself into the digital world. I was no longer a discarded daughter or a humiliated sister. I was a senior forensic auditor, and I was operating entirely in my element. The first step was completely dismantling the corporate veil Terrence had attempted to hide behind. He thought that registering a limited liability company in a business-friendly state would make him invisible, but he severely underestimated the software and the sheer willpower at my disposal. I bypassed the standard public search portals and logged directly into a proprietary financial tracking database I used for complex corporate audits. I typed Apex Horizon Holdings LLC into the primary search bar. The initial results were exactly what I expected. The company was less than a month old. It listed a generic registered agent service in Delaware designed specifically to shield the true identity of the owner. But a registered agent only protects you from casual observers. It does not protect you from someone who knows how to follow the digital ink of a wire transfer. Real estate transactions of this magnitude leave massive, unavoidable footprints. Terrence had purchased my apartment building in a rapid cash sale, which meant the capital had to originate from a verified banking institution to clear federal anti-money laundering regulations. I pulled the municipal property deed he had so arrogantly texted me and ran the parcel identification number through the county tax assessor network. I cross-referenced the closing date with public corporate banking registries. Within 45 minutes, I cracked the first layer. The cash used to buy my building was wired from a secondary holding company called Blue Onyx Consulting. I immediately ran a search on Blue Onyx. Unlike Apex Horizon, this company was not hidden behind a Delaware firewall. It was registered locally right here in Chicago. I pulled up the state business registration documents and leaned closer to the screen. The listed managing director of Blue Onyx Consulting was Jasmine. My sister had registered a phantom consulting firm. I cracked my knuckles and began typing faster, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Now that I had the name of the secondary shell company, I needed to find out exactly who was funding it. I opened a secure backdoor portal to access the publicly filed quarterly expense reports for Elijah Holdings, my grandfather's company. As a former employee, I still remembered the specific algorithmic patterns the accounting department used to log vendor payments. I ran a raw data extraction, matching the name Blue Onyx Consulting against the outgoing wire transfers from Elijah Holdings. The results populated on my screen instantly, and the sheer audacity of the numbers made my breath catch in my throat. For the past 3 years, Elijah Holdings had been paying Blue Onyx Consulting an average of $80,000 a month for abstract strategic lifestyle advisory services. It was an entirely fabricated expense. Jasmine was not advising anyone on corporate strategy. She was simply siphoning massive amounts of operational capital directly out of my grandfather's company and funneling it into her personal bank accounts to fund her designer wardrobe and her luxury vehicles. But $80,000 a month was not enough to explain the total financial devastation I was beginning to uncover. If Jasmine had one shell company, there was a very high probability that Terrence had his own. I expanded my search parameters across the entire vendor database. Grandfather Elijah was officially diagnosed with early onset dementia exactly 36 months ago. That was the exact moment my father Desmond took over as the interim chief executive officer, claiming he needed to protect the family assets from my grandfather's declining mental state. I set my auditing software to flag every single new vendor contract approved by the executive board within that specific 36-month window. I applied a secondary filter to isolate any vendors that provided vague, intangible services like marketing, consultation, management, optimization, or digital asset acquisition. The screen blinked once and then unleashed a massive cascading list of shell companies. There were 14 different limited liability companies. They had generic names like Summit Horizon Ventures and Emerald Capital Group. I began systematically pulling the registration data for every single one of them. It took me 3 grueling hours of relentless digital digging, cross-referencing tax identification numbers and tracing hidden wire transfers. By the time I reached the bottom of the list, my eyes were burning and my coffee had gone completely cold. But I had mapped out the entire criminal enterprise. Jasmine and Terrence were the registered owners of all 14 shell companies. Over the last 3 years, they had submitted hundreds of fraudulent invoices to Elijah Holdings for services that were never rendered. Fake landscaping upgrades for commercial properties, phantom digital marketing campaigns, fabricated legal consulting fees. But the most damning evidence of all was the authorization signatures on the outgoing wire transfers. Every single fraudulent invoice submitted by Jasmine and Terrence had been personally approved and signed off by 2 people. My father Desmond, acting as the interim chief executive, and my mother Brenda acting as the senior vice president of internal compliance. It was not just a case of 2 greedy siblings stealing from the cookie jar. It was a fully coordinated 4-person family conspiracy. My parents were actively facilitating the massive theft of their own father's life work. They were willfully draining the corporate treasury to fund a life of absolute excess for their golden child, while my grandfather slowly lost his memories in a hospital bed. I exported all the data into a master auditing spreadsheet and commanded the software to calculate the total sum of the stolen funds over the 3-year period. The algorithmic progress bar flashed across the screen for a few seconds before generating the final number. It glowed in bright red text against the dark background. $4,200,000. I stared at that massive number, letting the gravity of the situation wash over me. They had stolen over $4 million from the family empire. It was a staggering level of corporate fraud that carried severe mandatory federal prison sentences. And then the final missing piece of the puzzle violently clicked into place inside my mind. I finally understood the $250,000. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the dark ceiling of my apartment. The email my father had sent to the financial firms ruining my reputation was never actually about punishing me for asking too many questions. It was a highly calculated legal decoy. When a massive corporation like Elijah Holdings suddenly hemorrhages $4 million in operational capital, it creates a massive red flag in the annual financial ledgers. Eventually, the Internal Revenue Service is going to notice the discrepancy. The federal government does not simply ignore millions of dollars in missing taxable revenue. When the IRS inevitably came knocking, my father knew he would need a sacrificial lamb to throw to the federal auditors. He needed a scapegoat to explain the missing money and close the investigation before they dug deep enough to find the 14 shell companies. They framed me by officially declaring to the financial industry that a rogue senior auditor named Zuri had embezzled exactly $250,000. My father was establishing a documented paper trail of internal theft. He could write off the fabricated $250,000 as a corporate casualty loss on the annual tax returns. If the federal authorities ever questioned the financial instability of the company, my father would simply hand them my name. He would tell them that his estranged daughter used her elite accounting skills to manipulate the books and steal the money before running away. They were willing to send their own flesh and blood to federal prison just to protect their stolen luxury cars and their sprawling gated estates. They had engineered my entire downfall with cold, calculated precision. The eviction notice taped to my door was just the final step to ensure I was too broke and too desperate to fight back when the authorities finally came for me. A cold, hard smile slowly spread across my face. I looked back down at the glowing spreadsheet containing every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every digital signature my parents had executed. They thought they had designed the perfect financial crime. They thought they had buried the evidence under so many layers of corporate paperwork that nobody would ever find it. But they forgot that they had paid for my college tuition. They forgot that I graduated at the absolute top of my class. They forgot that I was quite literally trained to hunt down arrogant executives who thought they were smarter than the system. I pressed a button on my keyboard and began downloading the entire mountain of evidence onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I was not just going to clear my name. I was going to completely obliterate their entire reality. I had the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. Just as the download progress bar reached 99%, a sharp, sudden knock echoed through my silent apartment. I froze my hand, hovering over the keyboard. It was past 2 in the morning. Nobody should be knocking on my door at this hour, especially not in a building Terrence now owned. The heavy knock came again, louder and more insistent this time. I quietly closed my laptop, slipping it into my bag, before slowly walking toward the front door. I looked through the small glass peephole, expecting to see one of Terrence's aggressive property managers, or perhaps even the local police. Instead, I saw a man in a crisp, professional courier uniform holding a thick, heavy envelope and a digital signature pad. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, keeping the security chain firmly attached. The courier held up the package, checking the name on the label. "Delivery for Zuri," he said, his voice tired and flat. "It requires a direct signature. It is highly classified legal correspondence." I slid the security chain out of its metal track and opened the door the rest of the way. The hallway was freezing, but I barely felt the chill. I reached out and took the digital signature pad from the courier. I scribbled my name with my index finger, my mind racing with a million different possibilities. My father, Desmond, had already served me with a malicious eviction notice. What else could he possibly be hitting me with at 2 in the morning? A civil lawsuit for the fabricated $250,000. A restraining order to keep me away from the estate. The courier checked the green confirmation light on his device and handed over the package. It was a thick, tamper, evident waterproof envelope with a red pull tab across the top. He turned and walked back down the dim concrete hallway without another word. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and carried the heavy package over to my kitchen island. I held the envelope under the bright overhead pendant lights and examined the shipping label. The sender was not my father's local legal team. The return address belonged to a private wealth management and legal firm located in downtown Manhattan. The name printed at the top was Jonathan Montgomery, attorney at law. I stared at the name, completely baffled. I knew every single vendor, every contractor, and every legal representative associated with Elijah Holdings. My grandfather had always insisted on keeping his legal affairs strictly local in Chicago. He had used the exact same family attorney for 30 years. I had absolutely no idea who Jonathan Montgomery was, or why a high-powered New York lawyer was sending me classified documents in the middle of the night. I grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen drawer and carefully sliced through the thick plastic of the envelope. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy cream-colored cardboard folder. The material was thick and expensive, embossed with a subtle gold foil crest. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of crisp legal documents printed on premium watermarked paper. Resting right on top of the stack was a small, heavy object wrapped in dark blue velvet. I set the velvet pouch aside for a moment and picked up the first sheet of paper. It was a formal introductory letter typed in a sharp, professional font. "Dear Zuri," the letter began. "My name is Jonathan Montgomery. I am a private independent attorney retained directly by your grandfather Elijah, exactly 2 years ago. I am writing to you under his strict and explicit instructions. You are completely unaware of my existence because your grandfather demanded absolute secrecy regarding my legal retainer. We bypassed the standard corporate channels of Elijah Holdings to ensure that Desmond, Brenda, Jasmine, and Terrence had absolutely no knowledge of our partnership. I read those words and my heart completely stopped. 2 years ago. That was exactly 1 year after my grandfather was officially diagnosed with early onset dementia. That was right in the middle of the exact timeline when Jasmine and Terrence began setting up their 14 fraudulent shell companies and draining the corporate accounts. My parents had told the entire family that grandfather Elijah was losing his mind. They said he was confused, paranoid, and entirely incapable of managing his own finances. They had used his illness as the perfect excuse to seize total control of his empire. But this letter proved that my grandfather was not completely lost in the fog of his illness. He was lucid enough to quietly reach outside of his own company, outside of his own state, and hire an independent legal shark in New York City. I continued reading, my hands trembling slightly, holding the heavy paper. The letter went on. Your grandfather recognized that the assets of his primary corporate accounts were being aggressively compromised. However, due to the progression of his physical illness and his limited mobility, he was unable to intervene directly without tipping his hand to the individuals responsible. Instead, he engaged my firm to establish a completely secure secondary legal infrastructure. I am the sole executor of his true final testament. The local estate lawyer your father currently retains is operating under a heavily outdated and legally voided document. A massive wave of realization crashed over me. My arrogant father and my entitled sister thought they had successfully outsmarted an old, dying man. They had spent 3 years funneling $4,200,000 into their own pockets, laughing behind his back. But grandfather Elijah had seen every single thing they did. He had watched them steal his life work, and instead of confronting them, he had quietly built a massive invisible trap entirely around them. I am legally bound to present the true will this coming Friday at 10 in the morning, the letter continued. I will be flying into Chicago personally to execute this duty. I will meet you and your family at the local estate lawyer's office. Your grandfather anticipated that your father might attempt to legally bar you from the premises. Enclosed in this packet is a federal injunction superseding any local restraining orders or barring mandates your family may have filed against you. You have absolute legal clearance to be in that room. Do not let them intimidate you. I will see you on Friday. I set the letter down on the granite countertop. My mind was spinning. The sheer strategic brilliance of my grandfather was breathtaking. He had let them think they were winning. He had let them grow sloppy and arrogant, spending millions of dollars on luxury cars and expensive real estate. He gave them enough rope to completely hang themselves. I looked down at the dark blue velvet pouch resting on the counter. I picked it up, feeling its surprising weight in the palm of my hand. I pulled the small silk drawstring and emptied the contents onto the granite surface. It was a key. But it was not a standard brass house key or a small silver key for a filing cabinet. It was a heavy, solid gold key, intricate and antique-looking, with a sequence of 7 tiny numbers engraved along the barrel. It looked exactly like the type of high-security key used for private vaults in offshore banking institutions. I picked up the key, rolling the cool, heavy metal between my fingers. There was no explanation in the attorney's letter regarding what the key actually opened. But underneath the velvet pouch at the very bottom of the heavy cardboard folder was one final piece of paper. It was not printed on official legal letterhead. It was a simple piece of personal stationery. I recognized the faint watermark of the paper immediately. It was from the private notepad my grandfather used to keep on his desk in the home office. I picked it up. Written across the center of the page was a short message penned in dark blue ink. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my grandfather's script. The letters were slightly shaky, reflecting the physical tremors that plagued him in his final years. but the pen strokes were pressed deep into the paper, showing a fierce and undeniable determination. I read the words, and a hot tear finally broke free, tracing a path down my cheek. It was the first time I had cried since Mr. Harrison threw me out of his corporate boardroom earlier that morning. But I was not crying out of sadness or defeat. I was crying because in a family completely, entirely consumed by greed and betrayal, the only person who ever truly loved me had reached out from beyond the grave to protect me. The handwritten note contained only 3 short sentences. They think I did not see. Friday at 10 in the morning. Wear red. I read the note again and again, tracing my fingertips gently over the dark blue ink. They think I did not see. He knew. He knew about the 14 shell companies. He knew about the $4 million. He knew that my own parents had fabricated a massive corporate theft and pinned it on my name just to save their own skin. He had watched the people he raised turn into absolute monsters, and he had spent his final years meticulously preparing to completely destroy them. And he chose me to deliver the final blow. Wear red. It was such a specific and powerful instruction. Red was the color of absolute power. It was the color of a predator. It was the color you wore when you walked into a room and demanded that every single person look at you. In the corporate auditing world, a red flag was the ultimate symbol of discovered fraud. My grandfather did not want me to walk into that law office wearing a neutral morning suit. He did not want me to blend into the background or look like a grieving victim. He wanted me to walk into that room looking like the executioner. I gently placed the handwritten note back onto the kitchen counter next to the heavy gold key. I looked over at my laptop still sitting open on my work desk. I had the encrypted flash drives containing every single fraudulent wire transfer and fake invoice. I had the federal injunction guaranteeing my right to enter that building. I had the gold key to whatever hidden vault my grandfather had secured. And I had the absolute unwavering backing of a high-powered New York attorney. Terrence had told me I had 3 days to pack my garbage and get out of his building. He thought his eviction notice was a checkmate. Jasmine thought she was walking into that law office on Friday to inherit a multi-million-dollar empire. My father thought his perfectly crafted email had permanently destroyed my career and silenced me forever. They were all completely wrong. They had spent their entire lives underestimating me because I chose to work hard instead of relying on the family name. They thought my silence meant I was weak. They had absolutely no idea that I was just quietly gathering ammunition. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I pushed past the rows of practical gray and navy blue business suits that I had worn my entire career to blend into the corporate background. I reached the very back of the closet and pulled out a tailored, vibrant crimson-red power suit that I had purchased years ago but never had the courage to wear. I held the red suit up to the mirror, looking at my reflection in the dim light. My posture was perfectly straight. My eyes were sharp and completely devoid of fear. I was Zuri. I was a senior financial auditor. I was the granddaughter of Elijah. And this Friday at exactly 10 in the morning, I was going to burn my family's stolen empire straight to the ground. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air, but I felt absolutely nothing but a burning mechanical focus. I walked into the towering glass and steel building that housed my father's preferred local legal firm in the heart of the financial district. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors of the massive lobby. I was wearing the tailored crimson-red power suit exactly as my grandfather had instructed. The vibrant, heavy fabric felt like a custom suit of armor. Inside the inner breast pocket of the jacket rested the heavy gold key. Inside my sleek leather briefcase were the 3 encrypted flash drives containing the absolute destruction of my family's fabricated empire. And tucked neatly beside them was the federal injunction, signed by a judge guaranteeing my absolute right to be in the room. I rode the quiet elevator to the 50th floor, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher. When the doors finally parted, I stepped out into the plush, quiet reception area of the law firm. The young receptionist behind the curved mahogany desk barely had time to look up from her computer screen before I bypassed her entirely. I knew exactly where they would be meeting. I headed straight down the thick carpeted corridor toward the primary executive conference room. I did not bother knocking. I reached out, grabbed both of the heavy brushed steel handles, and pushed the double doors wide open. The scene inside the room was exactly as sickening as I had anticipated. The massive, polished oak conference table was littered with yellow legal pads, silver pens, and crystal glasses of sparkling water. My father Desmond sat at the head of the table looking incredibly relaxed in a custom charcoal gray suit. My mother Brenda sat right beside him, smiling warmly. Across from them sat my sister Jasmine and her husband Terrence. Terrence was actually leaning back in his expensive leather executive chair, chuckling at a joke, while Jasmine admired the sunlight catching the diamonds on her tennis bracelet. They were already celebrating. They were actively toasting to the multi-million-dollar inheritances they believed they were just minutes away from receiving. The moment the heavy double doors slammed against the interior wall, the entire room froze. The arrogant laughter died instantly in Terrence's throat. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance, and the collective shock that washed over their faces was absolutely priceless. The vibrant crimson red of my suit demanded total visual dominance, completely contrasting with their muted, conservative mourning colors. For a split second, nobody even breathed. They simply stared at me in total silence, as if a dead woman had just walked into the room. Then the illusion of their perfect mourning shattered completely. My father Desmond practically leaped out of his heavy leather chair. The relaxed, confident posture he held just a second ago evaporated entirely, replaced by a violent shade of purple rising in his cheeks. "What in the absolute hell are you doing here?" he bellowed, his voice echoing sharply off the thick glass walls of the conference room. He slammed his hands down on the oak table, rattling the crystal glasses. "I explicitly told you that you were legally barred from this building. You have absolutely no right to be anywhere near this reading." My mother Brenda dropped her glass of water, letting it spill carelessly across the polished wood. She stood up, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Have you completely lost your mind, Zuri?" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical octave. "You are a disgraced criminal. You do not belong in this room. You are ruining everything." Jasmine scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest and rolling her eyes with pure disgust. "I cannot believe you actually had the nerve to show up here," she sneered. "Did you not get the eviction notice Terrence sent you on Wednesday night? You should be back at your miserable little apartment packing your cheap clothes into garbage bags instead of crashing a private legal meeting." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward or break eye contact with my father. I walked calmly into the room, allowing the heavy double doors to close softly behind me until they clicked shut. I walked the entire length of the room and took a seat at the empty far end of the long conference table. I carefully placed my leather briefcase on the polished wood, folded my hands, resting them on top of the leather, and looked directly at Desmond. "I am here to listen to the final testament of my grandfather." I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I am a direct blood descendant, and I have every legal right to be present when his final wishes are read to this family." From the dark corner of the room, the local family attorney stood up. His name was Mr. Caldwell, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses who had spent the last 3 years functioning as my father's personal legal puppet. He cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and looked down his nose at me with an air of complete superiority. "Actually, Zuri, you do not have any legal standing to be here," Mr. Caldwell stated, using that deeply patronizing tone lawyers reserve for people they believe are entirely ignorant of the law. He picked up a thick stack of stapled papers from the center of the table and brandished it in the air like a weapon. "I am holding the final updated version of your grandfather's last will and testament, drafted and notarized just 6 months prior to his passing. Per your father's direct instructions as the acting chief executive and legal guardian of the estate, we conducted a thorough review of the beneficiaries. due to the unfortunate circumstances surrounding your employment and the missing $250,000 from the corporate accounts, you have been explicitly and entirely disinherited. Mr. Caldwell tossed the heavy document back onto the table with a dismissive thud. Your name has been completely struck from the estate trust. He continued, folding his arms across his chest. You will not receive a single dollar from the liquid assets, the real estate holdings, or the corporate shares. Furthermore, your father has already filed a preemptive barring order to prevent you from interfering with the distribution of this estate. You are currently trespassing on private property. If you do not leave this conference room within the next 60 seconds, I will personally call building security and have you escorted out of this building in handcuffs. Terrence leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and giving me a wide, arrogant smirk. You heard the man, Zuri? He taunted, his voice dripping with venom. The game is over. You tried to play the tough auditor at the memorial dinner, but you have absolutely nothing left in your hand. You are broke, you are evicted, and you are written out of this family forever. Do yourself a massive favor and walk out that door before you embarrass yourself any further and end up in a jail cell. I looked around the room, taking in their smug, victorious faces. They were so incredibly confident in their fabricated reality. My father was breathing heavily, but a self-satisfied smile was already beginning to form on his lips. My mother was sitting back down, smoothing out her dark skirt with a look of supreme triumph. They thought Mr. Caldwell and his stack of stapled papers was the ultimate trump card. They thought they had successfully locked me out of the castle and secured their stolen millions. I reached inside my suit jacket, feeling the cold, heavy metal of the gold key pressing against my fingertips. I glanced down at my silver wristwatch. It was exactly 2 minutes to 10 o'clock. I looked back up at Mr. Caldwell, offering him a slow, chilling smile that made his confident posture visibly falter for a second. That is a very impressive stack of papers, Mr. Caldwell, I said softly, my voice slicing through the tension in the room. It is a real shame that it is completely legally worthless. Desmond slammed his fist on the table again, the veins in his neck bulging. I am absolutely done listening to this nonsense, he roared, reaching across the wood for the black conference phone sitting in the center of the table. I am calling the police right now. You are going to federal prison today, Zuri. I did not try to stop him from picking up the receiver. I just sat perfectly still in my bright red suit waiting. Because exactly 10 seconds later, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open for the second time that morning. The phone receiver slipped from my father's grip and clattered loudly against the polished oak table. He stared past me, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. The heavy double doors did not just open, they were forcefully pushed apart by a man who commanded the space the absolute second he crossed the threshold. He was a tall, imposing figure, wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that screamed Wall Street authority. He carried a sleek titanium briefcase and moved with the rapid, uncompromising energy of a high-powered New York litigator. This was Jonathan Montgomery. But it was not just his presence that sucked the air out of the room. It was the two individuals walking closely behind him. They were two massive men wearing dark conservative suits with federal financial investigator badges clearly clipped to their leather belts. They looked incredibly serious, and one of them moved immediately to stand directly in front of the conference room exit, physically blocking anyone from leaving. Mr. Caldwell, the local family attorney, was the first to react. He scrambled to his feet, practically dropping his stack of stapled papers. "Excuse me," he stammered, his voice lacking all of its previous arrogant authority. "This is a highly confidential and private legal proceeding. You cannot just barge into my firm. I am calling building security right this instant." Jonathan Montgomery did not even look at him. He walked the entire length of the long conference table, completely ignoring my panicked parents and my terrified sister. He stopped right beside my chair, placed his titanium briefcase on the table, and finally turned his sharp gaze toward the balding local lawyer. "Sit down and close your mouth, Mr. Caldwell." Montgomery said, his voice a crisp, booming baritone that echoed off the glass walls. "Unless you want me to file a formal complaint with the State Bar Association for attempting to execute a fraudulent and legally voided document." Caldwell choked on his own breath, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray. He slowly sank back into his leather chair, looking desperately at my father for guidance. But Desmond was entirely paralyzed. He was staring at the federal badges clipped to the belts of the two investigators standing by the door. The confident, arrogant patriarch who had just threatened to send me to prison was now sweating profusely under the bright conference room lights. "Who are you?" Desmond demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private family matter regarding my father's estate. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here." Montgomery clicked open the latches of his titanium briefcase. "My name is Jonathan Montgomery," he stated, pulling out a thick, bound folder identical to the one I had received the night before. "I am the senior partner at Montgomery & Associates based in Manhattan. Exactly 2 years ago, your father Elijah retained my services to act as his sole private legal counsel and the exclusive executor of his true final estate." Desmond let out a frantic, desperate laugh, shaking his head violently. "That is completely impossible," he argued, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at the lawyer. "My father was officially diagnosed with severe early-onset dementia 3 years ago. He lacked the legal cognitive capacity to retain outside counsel. Any document you claim to have is completely inadmissible in a court of law." He did not know what he was doing. Montgomery offered a cold, razor-sharp smile that sent a visible shiver down my mother's spine. "I fully anticipated that exact argument," Desmond Montgomery replied smoothly. "Which is exactly why your father was evaluated by 3 independent board-certified neurologists from Johns Hopkins University on 3 separate occasions before he signed his final testament. I have their sworn medical affidavits right here in this folder. They unanimously concluded that while his physical mobility was failing, his cognitive function and memory recall were in the top 95th percentile for his age bracket. He was perfectly lucid. He knew exactly what he was doing. And more importantly, he knew exactly what you were doing." The color completely drained from Jasmine's face. She reached under the table and grabbed Terrence's arm, gripping his sleeve so tightly her knuckles turned white. Terrence looked like he was about to physically be sick. He kept glancing nervously toward the armed federal investigators guarding the door, his mind undoubtedly racing back to the 14 fraudulent shell companies and the massive real estate purchases he had just made. Montgomery pulled a single sheet of paper from his folder and slid it across the smooth oak table toward Mr. Caldwell. The local lawyer picked it up with shaking hands. "That is a federal injunction signed by a district judge just 6 hours ago," Montgomery explained, addressing the entire room. "It officially nullifies any barring orders or restraining mandates you attempted to file against Zuri. She is legally required to be in this room as a primary beneficiary of the true estate. Mr. Caldwell, I strongly suggest you pack up your voided paperwork and step away from the table. You have been playing checkers with a man who is playing 3-dimensional chess." Caldwell read the federal injunction and swallowed hard. He did not say a single word to my father. He simply gathered his yellow legal pads, picked up his briefcase, and moved quickly to the far corner of the room, distancing himself entirely from my family. He recognized a sinking ship when he saw one, and he was not about to lose his legal license defending a fabricated will. Brenda began to cry. It was not her usual manipulative theatrical crying. It was the raw, breathless panic of a woman who realized her entire world was about to collapse. Desmond sank slowly back into his chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for any possible exit strategy. But there was none. They were completely trapped in a glass box. "You still have not explained why federal agents are standing in my legal meeting?" Terrence finally spoke up, his voice trembling, trying desperately to sound tough. "This is an inheritance dispute. It is a civil matter." Montgomery turned his piercing gaze toward Terrence. "When an estate is valued at over $65 million and involves interstate corporate holdings, it falls under federal oversight. Montgomery explained, his tone dangerously calm. Furthermore, my firm has received highly credible evidence suggesting massive coordinated wire fraud and corporate embezzlement originating from the executive board of Elijah Holdings over the last 3 years. These agents are here to ensure that the assets of the estate remain entirely frozen until a full federal audit is completed. Terrence shut his mouth instantly, looking down at the table. He knew I had that evidence. I sat quietly in my red suit, watching the absolute destruction of their false confidence. I did not need to say a single word. My grandfather's trap was executing flawlessly. "We will not be reading from a stack of outdated papers today," Montgomery announced, pulling a sleek metallic tablet and a small high-definition projector from his briefcase. "Your grandfather was the man who demanded absolute clarity. He knew that if I simply read his final wishes from a document, you would attempt to contest it in court for the next decade. He wanted to look you directly in the eyes when he delivered his final judgment." Montgomery signaled one of the federal agents. The investigator reached over and pressed a button on the wall panel. The heavy motorized blackout blinds slowly descended over the floor to ceiling glass windows, plunging the bright conference room into a tense, shadowy darkness. Montgomery set the small projector in the center of the oak table and connected it to his tablet. He pressed a button, and a bright beam of white light shot across the table, illuminating the blank white wall at the far end of the room. The projector whirred quietly in the silent darkness. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We all simply stared at the illuminated wall, waiting for the ghost of the patriarch to speak. The bright white square on the wall flickered for a brief second before snapping into crystal-clear, high-definition focus. The entire room collectively held its breath as the image materialized. It was Grandfather Elijah. He was sitting behind the massive carved mahogany desk in his private home library, the walls lined with the thousands of books he had collected over his lifetime. He was wearing his signature charcoal tweed suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. But what struck me most was his face. My parents had spent the last 3 years painting a tragic picture of a frail, confused old man whose mind was slowly dissolving into the fog of early-onset dementia. The man on the projector screen was none of those things. His posture was perfectly rigid, his jaw was set like granite, and his dark eyes burned with a fierce, undeniable clarity. He looked directly into the camera lens, and it felt as though he was staring straight into the souls of the people sitting around the conference table. "My name is Elijah." He began, his voice echoing through the dark conference room with a deep, commanding resonance that commanded absolute authority. "I am recording this statement on the 14th of October, exactly 2 weeks before my scheduled major surgery. I am doing this of my own completely free will. I am of perfectly sound mind, and I am fully aware of the legal weight of my words." My father, Desmond, let out a ragged, suffocating gasp. He gripped the edge of the oak table so hard, his knuckles turned completely white. My mother, Brenda, pressed both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. They were watching a ghost rise from the grave to testify against them. Elijah leaned forward, resting his forearms on his desk, locking his intense gaze onto the camera. "Desmond and Brenda," he said, saying their names with a cold, heavy disappointment that felt like a physical blow. "You thought my physical illness made me blind. You thought that because my body was failing, you could convince the world that my mind was failing too. You used my medical diagnosis as a convenient shield to lock me out of the very corporate empire I built from the ground up. You stood in my bedroom and held my hand, telling me not to worry about the business, while you were actively funneling millions of dollars out the back door." Desmond squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly side to side as if he could physically deny the reality of what was happening. But Elijah was just getting started. "Jasmine and Terrence." My grandfather continued, shifting his gaze slightly. "You thought my legacy was your personal, automated teller machine. You thought I did not notice the sudden influx of luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, and the massive real estate acquisitions. You believed you were incredibly clever setting up those 14 shell companies. You thought burying your fraudulent invoices under layers of corporate marketing jargon would make you completely invisible. You are not clever, Terrence. You are a desperate, greedy man who married into my family because you lacked the discipline to build anything of value on your own. And Jasmine, it completely breaks my heart to say that you have become a woman entirely consumed by vanity and entitlement. Jasmine let out a sharp, trembling sob, burying her face against Terrence's shoulder. But Terrence was completely frozen, his eyes locked onto the illuminated wall in absolute horror. The arrogant smirk he had worn just 10 minutes ago was completely annihilated. You stole $4,200,000 from the operational accounts of Elijah Holdings. My grandfather stated the exact dollar amount, ringing out like a death knell in the silent room. You forged vendor contracts. You fabricated advisory services. And Desmond, you abused your power as the interim chief executive to personally authorize every single fraudulent wire transfer. You betrayed my trust. You betrayed this family, and you betrayed the thousands of hardworking employees who rely on that company to feed their children. I sat at the end of the table perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of their false reality. Everything I had discovered in my apartment at 2 in the morning was now being laid bare in front of two armed federal financial investigators. My grandfather had known the exact dollar amount. He had tracked every single cent they took. But knowing about the theft was not enough to put them behind bars. He needed legally binding, irrefutable proof. Elijah sat back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. I knew that confronting you directly would achieve absolutely nothing, he explained, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. You would have simply lied. You would have used my dementia diagnosis to claim I was paranoid and delusional. You would have tied the estate up in endless civil litigation until the money was entirely spent and hidden in offshore accounts. I realized that the only way to permanently protect my legacy was to let you keep stealing. I had to give you enough rope to completely hang yourselves. My mother Brenda let out a soft, pathetic whimper. The realization of what they had walked into was finally crushing her. They had not outsmarted an old dying man. They had willingly walked into a massive, meticulously constructed steel trap. I needed an airtight, legally bulletproof audit of every single fraudulent transaction you made. Elijah continued. So exactly 2 years ago, I instructed my private attorney, Jonathan Montgomery, to hire an independent forensic accounting firm right here in Chicago. I frowned slightly in the darkness, leaning forward in my chair. A cold spark of realization began to ignite in the back of my mind. I paid the firm triple their standard corporate retainer to execute a fully blind contract, my grandfather explained. All identifying markers of Elijah Holdings were completely redacted. The client name, the employee names, and the corporate tax identification numbers were entirely anonymized and replaced with alphanumeric codes. The accounting firm only saw raw numerical data and routing numbers. They had absolutely no idea whose corporate empire they were actually investigating. The spark in my mind suddenly erupted into a blinding flash of absolute clarity. My heart stopped beating for a full second. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared at the projection of my grandfather, feeling a wave of shock so profound it made my head spin. For the past 12 months prior to my father destroying my career, I had been assigned to the most complex and secretive audit my corporate firm had ever handled. It was a massive anonymized ledger designated internally only as Project Vanguard. I had spent countless late nights drinking black coffee, staring at spreadsheets, furiously untangling a massive web of 14 fraudulent shell companies. I had marveled at the sheer audacity of the anonymous executives who were stealing millions of dollars from their own company. I had mapped out every single wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every fraudulent signature. I had built the entire case file myself, completely unaware of who the targets actually were. Elijah offered a small, fiercely proud smile to the camera. I did not just hire any accounting firm, he said, his eyes shining with deep affection. I explicitly demanded that the blind contract be assigned exclusively to their most brilliant, their most uncompromising, and their most relentless senior forensic auditor. I needed someone who would never take a bribe, never look the other way, and never stop digging until they found the absolute truth. Desmond slowly turned his head in the darkness, looking down the length of the long oak table directly at me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood. They all finally understood. I hired my granddaughter, Zuri Elijah, announced, his voice filled with absolute triumph. The silence in the room was so heavy, it felt like the walls were collapsing inward. Jasmine let out a genuine scream of horror. Terrence shoved his chair back so violently, it crashed into the glass wall behind him. Desmond grabbed his own hair, pulling at it in a state of complete mental breakdown. "She has been auditing your theft for an entire year." Elijah continued, staring relentlessly through the lens. "Every time you bought a new luxury car, Terrence, she documented the wire transfer. Every time you purchased a new diamond bracelet, Jasmine, she traced the hidden funds. She built the entire federal case against you, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, and she never even knew she was looking at her own family. You tried to frame her for a miserable $250,000 to cover your tracks. You called her employers and branded her a thief. You tried to destroy her life, but you were completely blind to the fact that the woman you cast out as the family scapegoat was already holding the fully documented, legally binding audit of your $4 million corporate fraud." My grandfather leaned forward one last time. His expression turned completely cold, devoid of any remaining familial mercy. "Jonathan Montgomery is the sole executor of my estate," he stated, "but Zuri is the architect of your absolute ruin. I leave the final judgment entirely in her capable hands." "Good luck, Desmond. You are going to need it." The projector screen snapped to black. The small machine whirred down, leaving the conference room entirely silent, except for the panicked, hyperventilating breaths of my sister. The motorized blackout blinds slowly hummed as they began to rise, allowing the cold, bright morning sunlight to flood back into the glass room. I sat at the end of the table, the vibrant crimson red of my suit catching the brilliant sunlight. I felt a surge of absolute, unstoppable power rushing through my veins. My grandfather had not just given me the tools to clear my name, he had masterfully orchestrated the ultimate poetic justice. He had used my own brilliant mind to dig the graves of the people who hated me most. I calmly unlatched the silver clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp clicking sound echoed like a gunshot. I reached inside and pulled out the 3 encrypted flash drives containing the fully completed Project Vanguard case files. I placed them gently on the polished oak table right next to the heavy gold key. I looked at the 2 armed federal investigators standing by the door, and then I looked directly at my father. He was trembling violently, his perfectly curated life entirely reduced to ashes. The trap had officially snapped shut, and I was holding the only key. Jonathan Montgomery broke the suffocating silence in the room. He reached into his titanium briefcase one final time and pulled out a thick leather-bound master file embossed with the official seal of his Manhattan law firm. He did not hand it to my father, who was still sitting at the head of the table gasping for air. He walked around the polished oak wood and placed the heavy document directly in front of me. "Per your grandfather's final notarized instructions, the entire estate of Elijah Holdings is immediately and permanently transferred into an ironclad, irrevocable trust," Montgomery announced, his voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "This includes the $65 million in liquid capital, the commercial real estate portfolio, the private family properties, and every single controlling corporate share of the primary business. Because it is an irrevocable trust, it cannot be contested, modified, or dissolved by anyone sitting in this room." My father, Desmond, stared at the thick leather file resting under my hands. His jaw worked silently as he tried to formulate a sentence. But Desmond Montgomery said, cutting off whatever pathetic argument my father was trying to build, "You, will be relieved to know that your father did not actually disinherit you. He left specific provisions for you, Brenda, Jasmine, and Terrence, to receive your designated financial shares of the estate. Jasmine snapped her head up, her tear-streaked face suddenly flashing with a desperate flicker of hope. Terrence exhaled a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. For a split second, their greedy minds actually believed they had survived the explosion. They thought that despite getting caught, my grandfather was still too soft to cut his own flesh and blood completely out of the money. But there is one absolutely non-negotiable condition. Montgomery continued, his tone turning completely merciless. Your grandfather appointed a sole executor to oversee this irrevocable trust. This executor has absolute, unquestionable control over every single penny. They have the supreme authority to distribute the inheritance or to withhold it entirely based on their own independent assessment of your compliance. Montgomery gestured respectfully toward me. Zuri is the sole executor of the Elijah Holdings Trust. She now owns the company. She owns the properties. She controls the bank accounts. Effective immediately. Desmond, you are completely stripped of your title as interim chief executive. You are now entirely at the mercy of your youngest daughter. The flicker of hope on Jasmine's face died a sudden brutal death. Brenda let out another quiet, devastating whimper. The supreme irony of the situation was almost too heavy for the room to contain. My parents had spent my entire life trying to control me. They had spent the last 6 months actively trying to destroy my independence by branding me a corporate thief. And now, through a massive stroke of strategic genius, my grandfather had legally handed me the keys to their entire existence. I rested my hands flat on top of the leather-bound master file. I looked down the length of the long conference table at the 4 people who had made my life a living nightmare. The fear radiating from them was so thick I could practically taste it in the air. I did not feel any pity. I did not feel the lingering obligation of a daughter or a sister. I felt the cold, precise clarity of an auditor who was about to balance a very bloody ledger. I slowly stood up from my chair. The vibrant crimson red of my suit commanded the attention of every single person in the room. Even the 2 federal investigators standing by the door stood a little straighter. I have spent the last year of my life analyzing your blatant greed, I said, my voice steady and resonant, projecting clearly across the distance. I know about the 14 shell companies. I know about Blue Onyx Consulting and Apex Horizon Holdings. I know that you, Terrence, bought the apartment building I live in just 2 days ago so you could tape an eviction notice to my front door and threaten me with criminal charges. Terrence visibly shrank down in his expensive leather chair, refusing to make eye contact with me. He stared at his custom Italian shoes, as if he wished the floor would simply open up and swallow him whole. You stole $4,200,000 from this estate. I continued, pointing directly at the encrypted flash drives resting next to the gold key. Every single fraudulent invoice and unauthorized wire transfer is documented right there. You thought you could frame me for a fraction of your own crimes to save yourselves when the federal authorities finally audited the company. But you failed to realize that I was the one conducting the audit. Desmond finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling sound, completely stripped of his usual arrogant authority. Zuri, please, he begged, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. We are your family. We made a terrible mistake. The company was struggling and we panicked. We can fix this. We can sweep this under the rug and keep it completely private. You do not need to involve the federal government. We will sign whatever documents you want. Just do not send your own parents to prison. I looked at the man who had called my prospective employers just yesterday morning to ensure I would starve in the streets. Family does not intentionally destroy their own children, Desmond, I replied, my voice as cold as ice. You did not panic because the company was struggling. You panicked because you wanted to maintain a luxury lifestyle you never actually earned. I picked up the gold key from the table, holding it up so the metal caught the morning sunlight. This estate now belongs to the trust, and I am the sole protector of that trust. So here is the absolute law moving forward. I paced slowly around the edge of the conference table, closing the distance between us. I am giving you exactly 30 days to repay the $4,200,000 you embezzled, down to the very last cent. I do not care how you secure the capital. Sell the massive gated estate. Liquidate your stock portfolios. Jasmine, you can start by handing over the keys to that brand new Porsche you just bought. Terrence, you can liquidate your newly acquired apartment building immediately. Jasmine gasped, clutching her diamond tennis bracelet as if I were about to physically rip it from her wrist. You cannot do that, she cried, her voice shrill with panic. That is everything we own. We will be completely bankrupt. We will be ruined in this city. You ruined yourselves, Jasmine. I snapped back, my voice cracking like a whip. You built a lavish lifestyle entirely on stolen funds. Now the bill is due. If you manage to pay back the stolen $4.2 million within 30 days, I will officially distribute your designated inheritance shares as outlined in my grandfather's will. You will have enough money to buy yourselves a modest house and live a quiet, unremarkable life far away from my company. I stopped pacing and stood directly behind my father's chair, looking down at his sweating, trembling form. But if you fail to deposit that exact amount into the trust account by 5 o'clock on the 30th day, I will not grant you a single extension. I warned, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. I will hand these encrypted flash drives directly to the federal investigators standing right behind you. I gestured toward the two massive men guarding the exit. One of them stepped forward slightly, reaching into his dark suit jacket and pulling out a thick folded stack of legal papers. Those are federal arrest warrants, I explained, watching the absolute terror completely wash over my mother's face. They are fully signed by a federal judge and currently pending execution. Wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. That carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. You will not survive 15 years in a concrete cell, Desmond. And Jasmine, your designer clothes will not help you when you are wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit. The entire room fell into a horrifying, deafening silence. The ultimatum was absolute. They had completely run out of lies to tell and people to manipulate. They could not use their wealth to fight me in court because I now controlled all of their wealth. They were completely cornered by the very daughter they had thrown away. 30 days, I repeated, walking back to the end of the table and placing my hands flat on the leather master file. The clock starts right now. I suggest you leave this building immediately and start calling your real estate brokers. Because if I see any of your faces anywhere near my corporate offices before this debt is settled, I will have you arrested for trespassing on my property. Desmond slowly stood up from his chair, his entire body shaking like a fragile autumn leaf. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and profound, devastating defeat. He had nothing left to say. He turned toward the door, walking with the slow, heavy steps of a completely broken man. Brenda followed closely behind him, sobbing openly into her hands, no longer caring about her wealthy, high society image. Terrence grabbed Jasmine's arm, pulling her up from her chair. She was staring at me, her perfectly applied makeup completely ruined by her tears, her face pale with the sudden realization that she was no longer the untouchable golden child. She was just a common thief who had exactly 1 month to save herself from federal prison. They walked past the federal investigators, keeping their heads down, and practically bolted out of the glass double doors. They ran toward the elevators, desperate to escape the room where their entire fabricated empire had just been brutally dismantled. I stood alone at the end of the long oak table, watching the heavy double doors finally swing shut. The heavy double doors had barely swung shut when a loud, piercing shriek echoed through the thick glass walls of the conference room. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was a scream of pure, unhinged rage. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see their blurred silhouettes stop abruptly in the reception area. Then the heavy doors violently burst open again, Jasmine practically shoved Terrence backward into the room, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at the lapels of his custom charcoal suit. The flawless, elegant facade of the golden child completely imploded right in front of my eyes. Jasmine was hyperventilating, her face streaked with black mascara, her designer silk dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "This is entirely your fault," she screamed at Terrence, her voice echoing wildly off the walls. "If you had not lost millions of dollars playing pretend with your stupid cryptocurrency startups, we never would have needed that money. You dragged me into this. You promised me we were just borrowing it. You completely ruined my life." She hit him hard in the chest with both fists. Terrence stumbled backward, his own sheer panic instantly morphing into vicious defensive anger. He grabbed her wrists, roughly shoving her away from him. His arrogant alpha male persona was gone, leaving only a terrified, desperate coward. "Do not you dare try to pin this entire thing on me," Terrence yelled, his face turning a blotchy, violent shade of red. "You were the one charging $80,000 a month to a fake consulting firm just so you could buy designer bags and fly first class to Paris. You spent the money faster than I could even wire it." He turned wildly, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father, who was standing frozen near the doorway. "And I did not force your father to sign those authorization forms," Terrence spat out. "Desmond was the one who set up the corporate loopholes. He was the one who showed us how to bypass the internal compliance checks. He was siphoning cash out of the real estate portfolios long before I even married into this family." Desmond let out a panicked, breathless gasp, his eyes darting frantically toward the two federal investigators who were standing silently by the door, observing the entire breakdown. "Shut your mouth, Terrence," Desmond hissed, taking a step forward with his hands raised in a desperate plea for silence. "Are you completely insane? You are literally confessing to federal wire fraud in front of armed government agents." But the damage was already done. The loyalty they claimed to have for one another was a complete illusion. It was an alliance built entirely on stolen wealth and mutual greed. The absolute second the money was taken away, they turned on each other like starving animals in a cage. There was no love in that family. There was only leverage, and the moment I broke their leverage, they began tearing each other to pieces to save their own skin. My mother, Brenda, could not take it anymore. The wealthy, stoic high society matriarch, who had judged and criticized my entire existence, finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She stumbled back into the conference room, her knees practically buckling underneath her. She rushed toward my end of the long oak table, tears streaming heavily down her face, her heavy diamond necklace swinging wildly against her chest. She stopped just a few feet away from me, grabbing the edge of the polished wood to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Zuri, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with raw, desperate agony. "Please listen to me. I know we made mistakes. I know we treated you unfairly. But you cannot do this to us. We will lose our friends. We will lose our standing in the community. We will be completely destitute." She reached a trembling hand out across the table, trying to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped back out of her reach. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy octave. Brenda pulled her hand back as if she had been burned, but the pathetic tears kept flowing. "You are my daughter," she pleaded, her voice rising into a hysterical wail. "I carried you. I gave birth to you. We are your flesh and blood, Zuri. Deep down, you know that family is the most important thing in the world. You cannot hand that evidence over to the authorities. You cannot send your own mother and father to a federal prison. Have some mercy. We are family." I stood tall in my crimson-red suit, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like an unwanted burden. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the supreme cold detachment of a woman who had finally completely severed the toxic chains of her past. I looked at Brenda, then shifted my gaze to Desmond, Terrence, and Jasmine, who had all stopped screaming at each other to listen to my mother's desperate plea. They were all holding their breath, praying that the obedient little scapegoat they had manipulated for 35 years would suddenly reappear and save them from the consequences of their own horrific actions. I picked up my leather briefcase and slid the encrypted flash drive safely into the front pocket, locking the silver clasps. I picked up the heavy gold key and dropped it into my suit pocket. Family. I repeated the word, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. I looked directly into my mother's weeping eyes. Family does not intentionally frame their own daughter for $250,000 corporate theft just to provide a convenient decoy for the Internal Revenue Service. Brenda flinched violently, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. And family. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room with absolute lethal precision. Does not call an employer on the morning of a final interview to systematically destroy their daughter's livelihood. You did not care about my survival when you blasted my reputation across the entire financial district. You wanted me homeless. You wanted me ruined. You threw me to the wolves and you locked the door behind me. I picked up the leather-bound master file of the trust and tucked it under my arm. I walked around the large oak table, walking directly toward them. They instinctively parted like the Red Sea, stepping back to give me a wide, clear path toward the exit. I stopped right in the middle of their broken circle. So do not stand here and talk to me about family, I said, my voice perfectly calm and brutally cold. You have exactly 30 days to repay the $4.2 million. If the money is not in the trust account by the deadline, those federal warrants will be executed. In the meantime, you have 30 days to vacate my properties. I did not wait for a response. I did not need to hear another pathetic excuse or another vicious accusation. I walked straight past them, walking through the heavy glass double doors and out into the bright, quiet reception area. I pressed the silver button for the elevator, keeping my head held high, my posture completely unbreakable. The doors chimed and slid open, revealing the empty mirrored cab. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and turned around to face the law office one last time. Through the gap in the closing elevator doors, I saw my family standing in the ruins of their shattered lives. Jasmine was sobbing uncontrollably. Terrence was staring blankly at the floor, and my parents were holding on to each other in sheer, absolute terror. The heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting them off from my vision completely. The descent down to the main lobby was smooth and silent. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life was finally completely gone. The 30-day countdown began the exact moment I stepped out of that high-rise office building. I did not sit by my phone waiting for a miraculous apology. I went back to my apartment, packed my personal belongings, and moved into a beautiful luxury high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan. I used the initial executor allowance provided by Jonathan Montgomery to secure my new life and protect myself from any further retaliation. Meanwhile, my family descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. $4,200,000 is an incredibly massive amount of money to liquidate in a single month, especially when you have spent the last 3 years blowing it on depreciating luxury assets and failed cryptocurrency ventures. They thought they could easily secure a massive bank loan to cover the debt, but the financial world is incredibly small. Once the major banks realized Desmond was abruptly ousted from Elijah Holdings, every single line of credit was instantly frozen. Nobody was willing to lend millions of dollars to a man who had suddenly lost the keys to his own corporate kingdom. By day 15, the panic turned into a complete financial bloodbath. Terrence's shell company, Apex Horizon Holdings, was forcibly liquidated by his angry creditors. He lost the apartment building he had just purchased to evict me, along with every other real estate asset he had fraudulently acquired. Jasmine was forced to watch as the repo trucks rolled up to their driveway. I received the security reports from the estate detailing exactly how she screamed and cried on the manicured lawn, while 2 men calmly attached heavy chains to her brand-new $120,000 Porsche and towed it away. She desperately tried to sell her designer handbags and custom jewelry online to raise cash, but the luxury resale market gave her absolute pennies on the dollar. Her perfectly curated social media presence, where she used to flaunt her stolen wealth, completely went dark. My parents faced an even more humiliating reality. Desmond and Brenda frantically tried to leverage their high society connections. They hosted desperate dinners and begged their wealthy investor friends for a private bridge loan to save them from ruin. But the wealthy elite are notoriously ruthless when they smell blood in the water. The rumors of their massive corporate embezzlement had already started leaking out from the guests who witnessed my confrontation at the memorial dinner. My parents were quietly uninvited from the prestigious charity galas they used to sponsor. Their exclusive country club memberships were abruptly revoked. They became total social pariahs overnight. Their closest friends completely stopped returning their phone calls, unwilling to be legally or socially associated with a massive federal financial scandal. When the clock finally struck 5 in the evening on the 30th day, the irrevocable trust account was still short by $3.8 million. They had completely failed. I did not hesitate. I did not call them to negotiate or offer a pathetic last-minute extension. I picked up my phone and called Jonathan Montgomery, instructing him to hand the encrypted flash drives directly to the federal authorities. The hammer of justice fell with blinding speed. Terrence was officially indicted for multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Because he was the primary signature on the fraudulent shell companies, he took the heaviest legal blow. He was arrested at his home and carted away in handcuffs, facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Desmond and Brenda completely panicked and turned on him, fully cooperating with the federal prosecutors to avoid serving hard prison time themselves. They avoided federal prison by agreeing to absolute financial ruin. They were forced to declare personal bankruptcy, liquidating the massive gated estate where I grew up just to satisfy the remaining legal debts. They downsized to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their golden child. Jasmine moved into that tiny apartment with them, a disgraced former socialite with absolutely nothing left to her name and a husband sitting behind bars. A full year has passed since the day I handed over those flash drives. I am currently sitting in the corner executive office on the top floor of the downtown corporate headquarters. The heavy mahogany desk that once belonged to my grandfather Elijah is now mine. I completely rebranded the company, changing the name to Vanguard Financial Strategies, honoring the blind audit project that ultimately saved my life. The office is flooded with warm afternoon sunlight, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. I am no longer the desperate unemployed auditor rationing my groceries and living in fear of the next eviction notice. I am the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar empire, and I run it with the exact same ruthless integrity that my grandfather always demanded. I am currently reviewing the final approval documents for a massive new community development portfolio. Instead of using the company profits to fund luxury shopping sprees and vanity projects, I established a $10 million venture capital fund specifically designed to support young minority entrepreneurs from the south side of the city. I am reading the business plan of a brilliant 24-year-old woman who wants to open a chain of affordable, healthy grocery stores in urban food deserts. She has the passion and the absolute intelligence to succeed, but she lacks the financial backing because the traditional banking system refuses to take a chance on her. I reach across my desk, pick up my silver pen, and sign my name at the bottom of the approval page. I am giving her the exact financial lifeline my father tried to permanently deny me. I am using my grandfather's legacy to build people up instead of tearing them down. I have not spoken a single word to my parents or my sister since the day I walked out of that conference room. The total silence has been the most beautiful and peaceful experience of my entire life. I do not harbor any lingering anger or deep resentment toward them. They simply do not exist in my reality anymore. They chose to worship money and status above their own flesh and blood. And in the end, that exact worship was what completely destroyed them. I chose to rely on my own intelligence, my own hard work, and my relentless pursuit of the absolute truth. Before I wrap up this story, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family environment and build your own success from scratch? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that the truth always eventually comes to light. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with a family that constantly underestimates their worth. You are never as trapped as they want you to believe. When I look out over the sprawling city, I feel a profound sense of absolute closure. My family tried to take absolutely everything from me. They tried to bury me by calling me a thief. But they forgot one thing: the only thing I ever stole was their false sense of security. I built an empire with the bricks they threw at me.